Hi everyone. We're going to begin now. Hello. Welcome. So thank you everyone for coming to a very special night for NIF. My name is Eve Altman and I'm one of the program managers at the New Israel Fund Australia, and I have the pleasure of welcoming you all here this evening. So before I introduce our wonderful speakers, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Gadigal clan of the Eora Nation. NIF pays our respects to elders past and present and extend that respect to any First Nations people who may be present here tonight or watching online. We acknowledge that sovereignty has never been ceded and that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. It is so exciting that we are able to come together again for an in-person event in Sydney. Woo, yeah. However, we know that although everyone here is ready to do this, and that's really awesome, there are others in our community who aren't quite ready yet, so we're very glad to be live streaming this event to everyone who's watching at home. But regardless of whether you're watching at home or joining us in person, tonight's conversation is going to be exceptional. And I can say that with confidence because I've had the pleasure of spending this week with these lovely journalists. We have two distinguished journalists here tonight from Haaretz, Noa Landau and Judy Maltz, who will be joined in discussion by Debbie Whitmont. They will be covering a variety of topics, from analysis on the first year of the coalition government to reflections on the state of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and a discussion on the future of Israel's relationship with the diaspora. For NIF, these discussions are important as they help to illuminate the context in which we work. With your support, we fund an amazing array of civil society organizations in Israel, some working hard at building a shared society between Jewish and Palestinian Israelis. Others are working to create greater opportunities for the various streams of Judaism, while others are working for the civil and legal rights of the marginalized, Palestinians on both sides of the Green Line, Ethiopian Israelis, African refugees, and migrant workers. One of the things these partners of ours have been able to do with the current government is make great strides to shift policy in Israel to make it more inclusive and just and equal. Even though the coalition may be coming to an end soon, which is something we'll be diving into in our conversation tonight, we can still take these lessons of how important grassroots organizations are in realizing our vision for a more democratic and equal Israeli society. Like all NIF events, we hope that you take the opportunity tonight to not only learn more about the issues in Israel that concern us, but then to think about what it is that you can do. Helping our grantees to realize their vision of a just Israel is a concrete action each one of us can make. To help stimulate your thinking, we have placed brochures about some of our projects on your chairs, so feel free to have a look at those. So now I would like to introduce Debbie Whitmont as our moderator for this evening. Debbie is an award-winning journalist, author, and former Middle East correspondent for the ABC. Debbie has won 2 Walkley Awards for her work on the ABC's Four Corners and is a 3-time winner of the Human Rights Commission Award for TV for her investigations into the plight of asylum seekers and Indigenous affairs. Debbie, Noah, and Judy will be in conversation for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions from the audience. And if you're watching at home, you can put them into the YouTube chat. When we reach that time, we're going to have a microphone running around. I will be the microphone runner. So just put up your hand and then I'll come to you with the microphone and you can ask your question. And Debbie will call on you. So please join me in welcoming Debbie, Noah, and Judy for our conversation.
Thank you, Eve. Is this working? Oh, it is. That's good. Hello, and thank you all for coming out tonight on this really cold and wet and miserable night. It's fantastic to see so many people here. Now, at the risk of giving away my age, I was in the Middle East in the 90s reporting for the ABC, and I was always enormously frustrated because I knew the best paper in the country was Haaretz, but it was only published in Hebrew and I couldn't read it or understand it, and it was deeply, deeply frustrating. So I was very, very happy when it's now, is it 25 years? 25 years ago, they started publishing Haaretz in English, and now you can read it online, and I expect many of you do. And not only is it is the best paper in Israel, and I don't even say in my view, I'll just say that categorically. I think it's one of the best newspapers in the world, particularly coming from this country where we're rather sort of embarrassed in a media sense by a lack of diversity. So it's great to have both Noa and Judy here. Just to start, I don't want to get too deeply political. I don't know how much most of you know about Israeli politics, but it's endlessly fascinating, as you do know. So we've just had a change of government, and you had a change of government, a very exciting change of government a year ago, wherein you got a very motley coalition government of 8 parties with a slender majority, a coalition that spanned from right to left, and everyone said that won't last, but incredibly, it just celebrated its first anniversary, except now, sadly, the coalition's ship is sinking. And there are sort of 2 parts to this, but I thought we might just start, Noa, if you could explain what happened with the regulations, because the issue that's causing it to sink goes right to the heart of the occupation.
Right. So hi everyone, we're so happy to be here. This is a very exciting day for me because I saw a koala, and I'm told it's not a bear, so I'm really had to say that. Picture. I was so happy. And now to things that are less exciting. Yeah. Yes, the coalition just celebrated 1 year. I think many in Israel never thought that it would make it. So this is already pretty much, more than anyone anticipated. So what happened a week ago was that there was a bill that's supposed to be renewed every 5 years, which basically this bill is part of the bureaucracy of the occupation, in the sense that it is actually the bill that applies the Israeli law to settlers in the occupied territories. So you would have a Palestinian and a settler. The settler would be under Israeli law. The Palestinian would be under military law. This is true for Area C, which is where the settlers and Palestinians live in the same territory. And this is actually something that has been going on from the very beginning of the occupation, since '67. And this is part of the mechanism of how the legal affairs actually, how the procedures are done, which are based on another very bureaucratic mechanisms of emergency regulations. Emergency regulations, we inherited those from the British Mandate. And these are the regulations that allow us to maintain the occupation, but this emergency situation is ongoing. It's continuous. So every 5 years, you have to renew that specific law that applies the Israeli law to settlers. And unfortunately, it fell on this very, very complicated government. These 5 years ended exactly when it was their turn to handle it. And then something fascinating happened. The opposition, which is led by Benjamin Netanyahu now, but also has a Arab Palestinian party named the Joint List, and it's a diverse opposition, just like it's a diverse coalition. The opposition decided to actually vote against extending that occupation bill, because they basically decided they would vote against anything that this coalition would want to pass. So because they wanna end this government's term, so they're voting against anything. So Benjamin Netanyahu voted against the occupation, and then the coalition, which includes an Islamic party and also some left-wing parties, voted to extend it, to extend this bill which maintains the occupation. This is a reversed world. And it's, of course, small politics. It's not really, it's not about ideology. It's just now, it's a small politics game. And this is what's happening. And in the end, because 2 Arab Palestinian members of Knesset did not want to vote, they couldn't morally vote to extend this bill, they voted against, which means they couldn't pass the law. The coalition lost. they didn't have majority. So now we have until July 1st. On July 1st, it will actually expire. So they need to either find somehow a majority, or they need to, or it could actually end their term, or they need to find some kind of a legal solution to this situation. Now, it's not that the occupation is going to end overnight because just a legal bureaucratic detail is, preventing it to continue, but it is an obstacle that shows us how much this coalition is complicated.
Can you just hold that complex thought here, because I have done a terrible thing, which is what happens when you don't read your own notes, and I'm really sorry. I failed to introduce you both, which is pathetic. So allow me now to make up for that lapse.
They can just Google. Yeah,
Noa Landau and Judy Maltz. Noa is the Deputy Editor-in-Chief of Haaretz. She's the founder of Haaretz 21, which focuses on the voice of Palestinians, Palestinian communities. She's a former editor of Haaretz English, and I gather you're also a Reuters fellow, and you're on the board of Reuters. And Judy Maltz. Judy is a senior writer with Haaretz English. She specialises in the Jewish world and the diaspora. She's a founding editor of Haaretz English, and she's a distinguished filmmaker as well. And now, just going back to that, so what we're at is, and I'm going to ask you to comment, Judy, is where you've got a coalition of parties where the government and the opposition are each voting against their own ideology in order to, one to survive and the other to bring the ship down, on this piece of regulatory legislation that most people didn't even know existed. Do you find it surprising, Judy, or is it just a typical Israeli existential crisis?
Well, it's a typical existential crisis, but I think in the extreme. This is really extreme. And as you say, I think probably 97% of all Israelis never knew about this regulation that had to be renewed every 5 years. And in fact, it was just the bad luck of this government that it fell during the first year, a few days after its first year that it was going to expire. And I guess that's one of the things, they've done some stupid, they didn't think about everything, about what could happen. And this was one of those things that they knew it was coming up. Someone had to know it was coming up. So the question is, how didn't they prepare in advance? How are we going to deal with this when this comes up, considering the composition of our own coalition? As Noah just said, we have left-wing parties, 2 left-wing Zionist parties. We have the Arab Islamist Party, and with this opposition that has no more ideals. Its only ideal right now is to bring down this government.
You couldn't have a better example of having no ideals.
Yeah.
And it's also fascinating to think that the occupation has to actually be actively enforced every 5 years, which they don't really talk about. And I guess governments on both sides have just given it the nod and ticked the box. So it's just gone ahead. Now that isn't all, and this is sort of, I don't want to go into the weeds of Israeli politics, but it's interesting because we've now got a government that people said, well, it won't work because we've got a lot of independence and a crossbench, and of course Israel and its massive coalition is a very clear example of that sort of thing, an extreme example. But it isn't just that, is it, Noah? It also seems that there's a bit of a failure to wrangle people on the coalition. So you've got the left and the right both deserting, and it's actually proven to be a sort of tricky position for the left to be in this coalition that is got a right-wing prime minister. So, I mean, what's failed here? Has the prime minister failed to wrangle, or is it just that no one's got anything in common except they don't like Bibi?
Right. So I think the current political situation in Israel is pretty much an illusion, because if you take Bibi out of the equation, then you have probably around 70 seats in the Knesset that are definitely right-wing in terms of ideology, policy. This is the true situation in terms of if you just take Bibi out of this equation. But because Benjamin Netanyahu is so much of a, he's the one that glues the coalition together, and he's the one who wants to break it. He's the one that, because of him, part of the right wing doesn't, because they don't want to cooperate with him, because of the corruption allegations, etc., then it's kind of an illusion, this situation. And the fact that, yes, you have a right-wing prime minister and right-wing parties with the left wing and an Islamic party is, in the end, shows us, I think, how much the reality on the ground is just, it stays the same. The policies are almost basically the same, and regarding the occupation, for sure, the policy is still the same. You know, this government actually is extending the settlements more than the previous one. I mean, on the ground, they're actually extending settlements more than the previous one, and it's really interesting to see how the center-left in Israel is going through this huge dilemma. What is more important, our left-wing ideology or keeping Bibi outside of government? And it's not an easy answer, because they need to sit in this government that does the exact opposite of what they believe in, to see Knesset members of Meretz, you know, voting to extend what basically is de facto apartheid in the territories, you know, having two legal systems on the same territory, and then the Meretz members have to vote, you know, to extend that situation is something that's really hard for them. But on the other hand, if they don't, government falls and Netanyahu comes back.
And I think that this dilemma that Noah just mentioned, I think, though, that the majority on the center left, given the choice, would say, okay, we'll just swallow it. And it's more important that this government stays in power, because the alternative is so bad, and because there's absolutely no chance today of setting up a left government. So these are the alternatives. It's the least of all evils, as far as many are concerned.
You've been saying, when we were talking, that both of you, that Israel is moving more and more to the right. I mean, is that case, Judy? And if there were an election today, what do you think the result would be? Would it be the same as in the last election?
According to the polls, it would be pretty much, because the polls are showing once again that we're in a deadlock. You know, even though the Likud is getting stronger, how many seats does Likud have today? I don't know.
You have to understand, we went through 4 elections. Okay. So this is like really...
Right. But whatever
and they're heading
case,
back for a 5th, we think.
Right.
Yeah.
The polls do show that Likud would do better now.
Would do better.
Would do better, but still would not be able to get to the magic number 61, which would give them a majority. I mean, we're talking about Likud with the, I'll just call it the Kahanist party. It's called the Religious Zionist Party, but it's very far right. And its natural allies, which are the ultra-Orthodox parties. I'm not taking into account the right-wing parties that are part of the current coalition. But if that's, you know, who's in opposition right now, they don't have a majority. Every single poll, well, pretty much every single one, shows they still don't. So we're, again, back to square one with another election. Now, like what could happen is that, you know, maybe certain people, more people won't vote. That can always be a huge factor in the election outcome. If the Arabs don't vote, if the ultra-Orthodox vote less, if the left votes less. So, you know, that could change. But right now, looks like we're going to be back to where we were a year ago.
Right, if you have to vote, you know, for 4 times, then comes the 5th. It's not like you changed your mind. It's just like the only...
You either vote or you don't vote. I'm tempted to ask if the system is broken, or if it's just that Bibi has broken the system but I don't know if you can answer that.
Both.
Let's talk about something positive. NIF always likes to talk about something positive. And let me say that is often a pretty tall order. This government had made history in that it had an Arab-Israeli party in the government for the first time as part of the coalition. And I know you did a big interview with the guy who runs that. How has it worked as an experiment, and has it delivered for Arab Israelis or for Palestinians?
This is really interesting. So Ra'am, which is the Islamic party run by Mansour Abbas, took a very interesting decision to break this long trend by Arab parties that they don't join the government. And he decided that he wants to focus not on what divides Jews and Arabs, which is mostly, of course, questions about the occupation, national security, the conflict, etc. But he wants to improve the civil situation, civil rights for Arab Palestinians within Israel. And to do that, he argues, we need to sit with any government. So at the beginning, he was actually negotiating with Benjamin Netanyahu. And Benjamin Netanyahu, in that sense, because he needed, as many fingers as he could get to form a government, which was more and more difficult, kind of kosherized Mansour Abbas in the first round by negotiating with him. Then the fact that he was negotiating with him allowed also this government to reach out and offer him seats as well. And now he's still saying, he's even saying, which is really, it's so interesting to hear, is his strategic thoughts that are so different, criticize it or don't. It's really different. He says, I don't even mind sitting with Bezalel Smotrich and Itamar Ben-Gvir, those guys who are on the far right of the political spectrum. I don't mind. I would sit with anyone who is willing, because I want to take care of budget and equality within society. And that's his strategy. Of course, he's being heavily criticized from all sides. When I interviewed him a few weeks ago on the stage, there was a bodyguard with us on stage, and he said that basically threats are from all over. There are threats from Palestinians, from Jews, from anyone. So it would be interesting where this goes. Many describe this in Israel as an experiment, and people are asking, is this experiment working or not working? I mean, I think that something quite substantial already happened, which is this taboo of having our Palestinians within the Israeli government has been broken already. So this has changed. What would be another outcome? I don't know, but this is quite important in itself.
Judy, do you think that Mansour Abbas has managed to take his constituency with him in this willingness to sit down with anyone and talk?
If I go back to the polls, but Noah will tell me that the pollsters don't know how to evaluate public opinion in the Bedouin sector, which is the huge support base for Mansour Abbas's party. But it doesn't look that, according to the polls, like he has become more popular within his own party as a result of this brave decision. In fact, according to some, he might not cross the electoral threshold. So we'll only know when there's an election, because it could be that the polls are all wrong, especially in this particular sector of society.
It's interesting because this government passed a budget which hadn't been done for how many years? So I don't know how the country's been operating without a budget, but it has, because they were too busy having elections. So we too had a period of a minority government which passed more legislation than any other government, before or since. Just to finish the political analysis, what is going to happen now, Noah, and what is Bibi Netanyahu's play in all of this? Clearly, he's pulling the strings, even though he's supposed to have gone. He hasn't.
If only I knew what would happen now. Listen, yeah, journalists are such lousy, they have lousy prophecies, you know. I was in the UK during Brexit and in the US when Trump won the elections. We're so bad at, you know, predicting stuff. But
there are some mechanisms. I mean, Bibi might be trying to break up to woo some members away from.
Right. So what's happening now is that basically everyone, it's like with the chicken game now, because everyone knows that this government is now not in its best shape, and no one wants to be the last one to benefit some kind of a deal with the other side. So they're all playing chicken, and there are some MKs that already basically defected, and there are some that are considering. And what's happening now is that we also have all these sources within Gideon Sa'ar's party, Bennett's party, more on the right side of the spectrum, saying that they might consider even doing some kind of a deal with Bibi so that there will be a new government during this term and without elections.
They can do that.
So they can do that. I will also mention that according to when this new government was elected, the deal was that Bennett would be Prime Minister first and then Yair Lapid. And then there's also a question whether Bennett is so enthusiastic about Yair Lapid taking over. It's a question. It's not necessarily. I mean, they are
so the more right-wing one took
partners,
the first turn, and the slightly less right-wing one was taking the second turn.
Yes, that's the deal. Well, there's less of them, so they got a worse deal. But in the end, people officially, they're supposed to be partner in this, Bennett and Lapid, but it's not necessarily that they, you know, I'm not sure that it's Bennett's interest to just become the interior minister for Lapid's government. So this is a little bit more complicated.
These deals of I'll go after you never seem to work very well at all.
Remember not to be second.
Remember not to be second.
Such a deal. It doesn't seem to work.
Just wanted to talk a little bit about the occupation, and Haaretz has been running over the last week a lot of articles, and for longer than that. And one headline really struck me. It went, "Settlers attack Palestinians, Army punishes Palestinians, repeat," which is, I guess, what's happening. But Judy, there's been, over the last couple of years, a greater degree of violence against Palestinians in what they call Area C in the West Bank. And I mean, what a lot of your articles are saying, not you two personally, but the paper's articles are saying that this is all part of a very deliberate strategy by settlers basically to scare Palestinians off and regain the land. Mm-hmm. Is that a sort of noticeable and accelerating trend? And tell us about it.
It seems to be. The settlers that you're talking about are those who, often those who live in these, we call them illegal outposts, in pretty isolated areas of the West Bank, and it's really very much the wild West Bank out there. There's no law and order, and for whatever reason, the army does not want to deal with them. The police out there do not want to deal with them. You have some really very brave activists who go out there, Jewish and Palestinian, who go out there every week and try to help them, whether it's helping them with their olive harvest so that they don't get attacked. But you know, you have almost every week these scenes where the activists go there to help the Palestinians, and then you get these very violent settlers who come after them and attack them and hurt them. Many times they end up in hospitals, and the army does nothing. In fact, the army will even arrest them.
Right,
So,
because you remember that we said that the Israeli law applies to the settlers and the military law to the Palestinians. So it means that actually the ones who need to deal with the settlers are the Israeli police. But the Israeli police is not there when it's happening.
there.
It's the army, it's the military. So the military actually could interfere, but they don't.
Sometimes in some of these really crazy places, the army gets attacked too. Like there's this settlement called Yitzhar.
But as you were saying, Noah, this government has legitimized these Wild West settlements. Even though this government contains Meretz, the left-wing party, it's actually done more to, I gather they've connected the illegal settlements to power and water, and they're establishing themselves as a land grab, really. I mean, how does the left deal with that in the government?
They basically don't have enough political power to stop it. I mean, you could claim that they could negotiate more, that they can put more pressure, because Mansour Abbas's party, Ra'am, does put a lot of pressure on the government on the issues that they care about, like connecting Bedouin communities to electricity, etc. So you could maybe claim that Meretz could do more, but it's not like they have all the power in the world to do whatever they want in this government. So
it's that dilemma of signing up to be with the devil to be in power, or what do you do? I mean, one thing, we were looking for positive angles on all of this, of course, desperately, as usual.
Where was the positive?
And Judy was telling me a nice one, which is, like you always like to think that, okay, politics may be a disaster, but relationships between actual individual Israelis and Jews, Israelis and Palestinians are a different thing, down on the ground, it's a different thing. And Judy has written and was telling me about the new holiday destination for Israelis who can't travel overseas, or it's more difficult to travel overseas, which is actually East Jerusalem.
Well, I don't know if it's still true. This was true, I think it was last summer when we were in lockdown because of COVID. So this interesting situation emerged where I don't know how many of you have visited the American Colony Hotel in East Jerusalem. It's a very, very beautiful hotel.
Most beautiful hotel in the world.
with a very interesting history. And I guess it still is. It was always known as the Hotel of the Foreign Press Corps in Israel, and was sometimes referred to in the past as the PLO Hotel, because it was a place before Oslo where Jews and Palestinians could meet. So for many years, I know that Israelis sometimes didn't feel comfortable going there. In general, they don't go to East Jerusalem. They don't hang out there. But what happened is that during COVID, Israelis couldn't leave the country, or many didn't want to. They didn't want to get stuck abroad, not be able to come back. So they were looking for new destinations that seemed to be a little bit of what we call a chutz la'aretz, out of the country. At the same time, the poor American Colony Hotel, which had always relied on foreign visitors and foreign journalists, was empty. So a lot of Israelis started going there, and by chance, I was one of them last year. And by chance, while I was swimming in the pool, I met one of our photographers there, and we both marveled that we were sitting at the American Colony pool, and it was all Israelis reading Haaretz in Hebrew, and funnily enough, the waiters and waitresses were all Palestinians, many of them from East Jerusalem, but they also come from places like Ramallah. They were making an effort, a really nice effort, to speak to us in Hebrew, which wouldn't have happened in the past. And the general manager said that he was actually offering them Hebrew lessons so that they could better service this new, quite unusual clientele of Jewish Israelis. So I don't know if it's still going on.
Except you said there was a terrible incident when there was a couple of explosions and everyone jumped out of the pool in horror to find out that it was fireworks going off.
Because of the matriculation exams in the high schools in East Jerusalem.
On a more serious note, we were talking about studies showing that this sounds like a climate change statistic, but by 2040, 1 in 4 Jews in Israel and in the United States will be Haredim, Orthodox.
Ultra-Orthodox.
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 how has this come about, and what does it mean?
Well,
What will it mean?
it comes about because the ultra-Orthodox have a much higher birth rate than other Jews, especially in Israel, because in Israel it's easier to have a lot of kids because there's a lot more government support than there is, for example, in the United States, and I assume in the UK, even though this study showed that actually within 20 years, the ultra-Orthodox will be a majority in the UK.
A majority
A
in the
majority,
UK?
yeah.
Why? Well, that's not just government assistance for birth rate, is it?
No, because they do have a lot more kids than non-ultra-Orthodox Jews who tend to have not that many kids. And so their feeling is that nothing major is going to change in the next 20 years for the ultra-Orthodox to start. They're not all going to start going on birth control or anything or leaving ultra-Orthodoxy. So they're assuming that these current trends will continue, and it's just math.
But apart from, you know, a few TV shows that have given them a lovely image, you also had recently a series of scandals where it seems a number of religious leaders and, you know, the famous children's book author, they've all been unmasked as child abusers, pedophiles. I mean, isn't this rather damaging to the ultra-Orthodox cause? That doesn't seem to matter at all?
Well, there were two very famous ones. It wasn't all of them.
No, it's not all of them. It does seem to be, there's been an unveiling.
Two very, very, very well known ultra.
There were two specific cases, but you know, it's like in every community we see that. I don't think that Me Too skipped any kind
You're
of
being very fair there,
community,
but there was an article in Haaretz that said, someone said the other day, there wouldn't be a boy in the community who hasn't been abused. I mean, it does seem quite extensive.
I didn't read that quote, but that sounds to me very exagerated. This is, you know, these are specific stories about specific people.
Yeah.
It's not the whole community.
Oh, I will rein that in.
But it shook up the community. It definitely shook up the community.
It did.
Yeah, and not only the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel, but the ultra-Orthodox community in America, and I'm assuming ultra-Orthodox communities all over.
I mean, everyone's been through it. The Catholic Church has gone through it too.
Yeah.
And so does that mean that there's change?
I think it would be too early
to say,
you know.
Okay, we're getting close to your questions. While you're thinking of your questions, Noa, I just wanted to ask you, so you're going back, you said you think you'll be covering an election pretty soon. What about the visit of the American president? How is this going to play into the Israeli political scene?
Right, this is fascinating because so President Biden is going to Saudi Arabia, then coming to Israel, and of course there's a lot of rumors and discussions about how he might want to promote not full normalization like in the Abraham Accords with the UAE or Bahrain, but some kind of a new rapprochement between the Saudis and Israel, which is really interesting on several levels. First of all, the Saudis have been the ones most reluctant to get into those agreements because of course, the king, which is older and sick also, but he kind of kept the Palestinian file for himself because he thinks that this is one of his most important files, and he's less enthusiastic about normalization. But also it's interesting from the perspective of the United States, because Biden was, of course, one of those people who were so critical of Saudi Arabia after the whole Khashoggi affair. And now suddenly we see that with the oil problem in the United States, he needs those relations like presidents before, and he's suddenly speaking with a bit of a different tone. So we'll see what kind of exact deal he brings to the table, but it will probably be something around defense, some kind of an alliance against Iran, and not necessarily normalization agreements like with the other countries.
Does it affect the Israeli politics, I mean, on a simple level that whoever is leader gets to be seen with Joe Biden, and of course in an imminent election context, that's quite an advantage. I mean, is there a bit of jockeying around that?
Yeah, of course. I mean, Netanyahu, I think it was the third round of the election, he had all these posters around Israel of him with Trump or with Putin, and the title said like a league of its own. It was all about like foreign affairs, and now he's the only leader that could really represent it, that has some kind of a status internationally. So it's very important for Bennett also, all Israeli politicians, to be, seen as on the same level. This whole bizarre affair with Bennett went suddenly to Putin to negotiate, a deal between Russia and the Ukraine, which was totally absurd. I mean, first of all, maybe you can start at home, negotiating and bringing peace. And second of all, what was it like? What did you think they would, convince Putin of? But in the end, it was also about like creating this image of him as a statesman.
And yet, on the other hand, Israel has taken a very different attitude to the United States with regard to the invasion of Ukraine. So, I mean, Volodymyr Zelensky has actually asked if he can buy your Iron Dome missile defense system, and Israel has said no. So is this a little bit of tension there?
It's really interesting. Most Israelis are, there isn't a poll, I think, but most Israelis, it seems like, are quite supportive of the Ukraine in this situation. But on the other hand, of course, Russia is now our neighbor in Syria. So there are pragmatic realpolitik considerations that I think most Israelis understand and agree with, that Israel shouldn't just be standing with the Ukraine against Russia. They think they would put Israel in a problematic situation. So they do understand the government's position to be a bit more careful. But still, I think most Israelis see themselves as part, of a liberal, democratic West, and they feel like they're on the Ukraine side on this issue.
Which is interesting because there's all the baggage from the Holocaust, and Israel, like Melbourne, where we last met, has a very large population of Holocaust survivors. And I know it was many Israelis. For example, my family comes from that part of the world that was Poland and is now Ukraine, on the border there near Lviv. And, many of us grew up hearing from our parents and grandparents that, the Nazis were bad, but the Ukrainians were worse. And then, you really have to come around. It's a big mind shift to suddenly feel the sympathy. We have a lot more bad memories of the Ukrainians than the Russians, and to suddenly ally ourselves with the Ukrainians.
It's all a bit of an Alice in Wonderland world, isn't it? I mean, but also you've got the situation of a country being invaded by a bigger country, which has its own Holocaust.
Exactly, and also there's on the one hand, there's of course, that democratic liberal issue, of the rule of law, etc., which is also kind of ironic. But also on the other hand, there's the issue of nationalism. I mean, the whole war is about also self-determination and nationalism.
And thirdly, Judy, Israel has its own Russian and Ukrainian populations, and it's also taken in Ukrainian refugees.
And even more Russian. Well, they're not refugees. In a way, they are. That's an interesting
thing. But they came ages. You mean, new
no,
Russians?
They came
now,
yes. Yeah.
Actually,
fleeing Putin.
Yes. Yeah. There's more from Russia who've come than from Ukraine.
Is that right?
Yes. That's fascinating.
Lots of people from Moscow are now hanging out in Tel Aviv.
Yeah.
By the way, unable to withdraw money, or there are all these issues with the sanctions also. So it's interesting. There are many people from Moscow now in Tel Aviv.
And I think the thing is, with many of the Ukrainians who came, I don't know so much to Israel, but many of those who are Jewish or eligible to immigrate to Israel who left, they want to go back if they can. They left behind fathers and brothers and sons who are fighting. And I think if they really wanted to move to Israel, they could have done it. There were many years.
Right,
So it was never, but I think the Russians who are coming now, I don't see them going back so fast, really.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, if all of that hasn't done your head in too much, and you can think of a question, I think we're ready for some. Has anyone got one? Got a microphone? Thanks, Eve.
Hi, everyone. I really appreciate all your talks. I really appreciate all of that. There's been a slow but steady shift of growing sympathies towards the situation of Palestine among the populations in many of Israel's closest allies, such as the US and Australia. And I think it's now the case that more Democrats in the US are more sympathetic to Palestine than Israel, and the platform of the Australian Labor Party now states it desires to officially recognise the state of Palestine. If countries like the US and Australia soon recognise Palestine while still maintaining their existing relationships with Israel, will that change the dynamics in Israeli politics at all? And will that also change the situation in Palestine on the ground from what you see?
Good question.
So, yeah, I heard there's a lively debate now in Australia about the recognition of Palestine. On a symbolic level, it matters because it would be a boost for Palestinians. And also, if you support the two-state solution, then you recognizing both states is not such a big deal. But in terms of actual change on the ground, many countries recognize Palestine. That doesn't necessarily, has an impact, on the ground. And I'm not even sure, I was trying to think, if I file a story now that says that, there's a lively debate in Australia whether to recognize Palestine or not, I'm not even sure it will be on the front page of the newspapers in Israel. It's one country, out of many. And I think, if it will happen, probably many Israelis will be against it and they'll condemn Australia or whatever. But in the end, what would be, then after the condemnation, what will happen? Will Israel just break its ties with Australia? No. I mean, Israelis love come to Australia, The Israelis love Australia. I don't see, how they'll stop the relations or something. I don't think so. So it's all very on it's on the symbolic level. So if you support the two-state solution, you think that there should be two states, it's not such a big deal recognizing both states. And I think in terms of, the outrage that would be in Israel, that's also not something that I think will have a massive, impact on everyday life or the relations.
And I would add that it's not a majority anymore. It used to be a majority, but I think a plurality of Israelis also think the two-state solution is the best solution. So.
How realistic is the two-state solution these days?
Right now.
Brief answer.
It's the most realistic solution that we know of. The thing is that people are really despaired. I mean, it's so pessimistic. But I can't think of a more a solution that makes more sense. There's a lot of talk now about maybe a confederation model. More and more people talk about the one-state solution because they're so frustrated with the fact that the two-state solution is not happening. But it doesn't mean that it's still, I think, the solution that makes the most sense.
Judy?
The point is, we've never tried it.
That's true. Yeah. Another question?
Hi all. Oh, sorry. Hi all. I wanted to ask a question more, I guess, along the civil lines of what's happening in Israel. So obviously, I have a lot of family living there. Societal costs are rising. Cost of living is huge. It's one of the many reasons certain parties are making, I guess, the sacrifices they're making to be part of the current reigning coalition. Do you see at any point, with the fact that budgets are very difficult to get passed and all of these social problems aren't really effectively being tackled, do you see there being a point at which civil outrage in Israel will get so big that you'll have, I guess, not necessarily an Arab Spring, but kind of a big social push towards dealing with those kinds of problems on the ground and I guess letting parts of the conflict
I think it's starting now again. From what I read a day or two ago, I don't know if you remember, in 2011, there were the huge social protest movements in Israel. Hundreds of thousands of people went out into the street, and it started with young Israelis who couldn't afford housing or rent, who set up tents in the middle of Rothschild Boulevard in Tel Aviv. And from what I heard, there's a group now that's starting to set up tents there as well, because rent prices have gotten out of control. And forget about even thinking about buying a house in Israel if you're a young couple. So yeah, it could be starting again now.
It's such a cliche, but I was chatting with the Uber driver at some point, and I asked him, what about the recent elections, and what did he think was, what caused the shift? Because I'm always trying to think, is there something we can learn from what happened in Australia now? And I asked him, what are the major issues that people were voting about? And he was like, oh, housing in Australia is it's a huge problem. So some things are also quite similar around the world. I don't know if the last protest in 2011 basically brought Yair Lapid to the Knesset in some sense. Did he fix the situation, that brought him there? Not really. I mean, I don't even know if you can fix, the housing problem.
Another question? Yeah, I gather Tel Aviv would be even more expensive than Sydney. Yeah,
it is.
Yeah, I mean, it was just declared the most expensive city in the world, Tel Aviv. Thank you.
This is a question predominantly to Noa, because you use the term...
Oh. Someone doesn't want you to ask something. Let's see what it is.
Just a bit of emphasis for your question.
You used the term in response to an earlier question, de facto apartheid. A recent report that came out and described Israel as apartheid was criticised widely. Huge fury about that term being used to describe Israel. Would you like to comment?
Sure. It's easier to talk about is there apartheid or not in the West Bank than within Israel, because in the West Bank, when you have, what is, I don't super like the fact that we compare a very specific historic situation to another. So in terms of comparing what happened in South Africa to what's happening in Israel, I think it's problematic, because nothing in history is just like something else in history. They're all unique, particular cases. But if you refer to apartheid as having two legal systems, on the same people, on different people on the same territory, then it's easier, to talk about apartheid in the West Bank. Talking about apartheid within Israel is more problematic, but there's, it is a discussion, because Israel is the country that applies these laws to the West Bank. So can you say that Israel is a total democracy within its own borders, but what colonial on, outside its borders? It's a very complex discussion. And I wouldn't just, I'm not even sure I am certain about my answer, regarding apartheid within Israel. So I wouldn't say, some people treat it as a very easy question. I'm not sure it is.
Judy, would you like to buy into that?
I agree with what Noa said.
I mean, essentially there are, well, certainly in the West Bank, there are two systems which operate to the disadvantage of one group of people, or one group of people is less advantaged than another.
And West Bank Palestinians can't vote, obviously, in the Israeli elections, but Palestinians who live in Israel can.
I can see your argument about whether that applies in Israel, but it sort of all gets a bit technical, doesn't it?
Listen, the talking point would be that that the Palestinians living in the West Bank, they have the PA, the Palestinian Authority, and they're citizens, and everything's lovely. But it's not exactly the true situation. And also the same people, those talking points come from people who oppose a Palestinian state. So the citizens of where would exactly those people be? So it's kind of contradicting.
Another question?
I'm interested in your comments on the Israeli justice system. You know, from two perspectives, both the prosecutorial side, Attorney General, and the Israeli Supreme Court. And in relation to the prosecution, I mean, we were told, or we thought, when Netanyahu ceased to be Prime Minister, then we'd see some action against him on the grounds of alleged corruption. It seems like that's going nowhere at the moment. I mean, any comments on that? But I'm also interested to hear what role the Israeli Supreme Court is playing at the moment, and whether you think, like the US Supreme Court, is a highly politicized court.
So for a long time, because so during the 90s, there was a revolution in the Israeli legal system, a human rights revolution within the Israeli courts. There was a lot of legislation around human rights, and then the liberals kind of gathered to protect the courts against criticism from the right wing because of that human rights revolution. And then in recent years, when Netanyahu started to attack the legal system because of his own problems with the law, it felt also like kind of everyone's gathering from the center-left liberal point of view. People wanted to protect the courts. On the other hand, we do see that there are more and more incidents where the courts actually now protect what is the policies that are happening on the ground. And there is also a claim from mostly from the left that it is the Supreme Court of Israel that actually allowed the occupation along all these years. So it is also complicated, and of course the right wing wants to. Of course, there's a lot of politicization around the courts. Of course, the right wing wants to appoint more conservative judges. There's a lot of Americanization also of the conversation in Israel. A lot of Americanization within the right wing in Israel. Libertarians, for example, is something we didn't quite have a while ago, and now is growing in Israel, a lot of that. So yes, there's even this government said that they want to appoint more conservative judges to the courts. So I think there's also kind of a dilemma now in the amongst Israel's liberals. Should we protect the courts against the attack from the right wing, or should we acknowledge the fact that the courts are a part of the system?
But there is a bill floating around that hasn't been passed, am I correct? Which is the bill that says that you can't charge a sitting prime minister with a crime, which is the bill that Netanyahu wanted to have put up. I'm probably characterising it wrongly, but that hasn't come up, or it will. I mean, is that at the heart of his challenge here too?
So there are two bills that everyone keeps arguing about. Of course, Netanyahu wants a bill that says that you can indict a sitting prime minister. On the other hand, there's also a bill talking about the limiting the number of terms that a prime minister can, which is the law that this government promised and failed to pass.
And there's also a bill that hasn't been passed. I mean, this was supposed to have been under this government, that wouldn't allow someone who has criminal charges against them to serve as prime minister.
Hasn't passed.
No.
Another question? Two more?
Thank you. Look, I'd just like to say that the rumors and stereotyping against the ultra-Orthodox abusing
I apologise for that misinformed statement.
Yeah, well, I mean, it happens in every culture, and it happens in every nation and ethnicity and that sort of thing. And I suffer from it myself, as in that's what people perceive me as, although I'm not Orthodox. The second thing I wanted to ask is there any statistical data where the settlers are attacking the Palestinians and or Muslims per se.
Well, there's a lot of documentation done on the ground by human rights groups. I don't think there is official data in terms of the state, because if they do not interfere, if there are no arrests, then how would you know the numbers from the official state point of view? But there are a lot of organizations documenting this on the ground. So.
There's a question over here that I know you've been putting your hand up since the beginning.
Hello. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Great. I just want to ask, I think it's interesting because you guys were saying that there's been more of a shift in politics to the right, but I just want to understand a bit more about what the opinions of Israelis on the ground are in terms of the occupation, because I guess that's not necessarily the only reason why people vote, and how much is that the reason why people vote. Just the same way that I guess, we see things happening in other countries within political systems, but don't necessarily assume, that's what the entire population supports. So I just want to understand a bit more, like, from your perspective, what actually on the ground do Israelis think about kind of the policies that are being passed and what's happening in terms of the occupation in Israel?
I think most Israelis support the occupation by being silent about it. Because most Israelis, first of all, it would definitely not be the main issue that Israelis vote about. It's not. Like, housing would clearly be much higher on that list. And I think one of the things that we see in Israel in recent years is a very efficient separation policy. You have the physical separation wall, but there's also the mental separation, which is that most Israelis really do not encounter, do not know, do not see the occupation or Palestinians. I mean, most Israelis don't have Palestinian friends. They have no idea how they live, whether it's Palestinians within Israel or outside Israel in the territories. So there is I think a very efficient separation situation where and most Israelis just really don't really care and don't really see, hear, or are not well informed about the occupation. And this is, of course, part of the problem. But do they support it, positively? I mean, I'm not sure that's the case. Although most Israelis would argue that there are reasons that this is happening. I mean, that there are security issues that force us to occupy the territories.
I would add, on a positive note, because maybe we want to.
Why are we always trying to be positive? Is it like,
I don't know.
Why? It's just reality. It's not.
So, I don't think I've ever seen a survey that asked, "Do you support the occupation?" Right. But if you want to know what percentage of Israelis actively support the West Bank settlement project, then definitely a very small minority, because only a very small minority live out there. Okay? And if you look at the trend in recent years, there's actually, the population there is growing, but it's only growing because of natural reproduction. It's not growing because Israelis from Tel Aviv or Haifa are moving across the Green Line. In fact, there's net emigration from there. The only thing that's that, and the two, there are two very, very large ultra-Orthodox settlements that are growing the most, and because we spoke before that the ultra-Orthodox have more children, and that is what is driving the population growth out there. That's a positive note, right?
That's a positive note. But it's interesting because, I mean, isn't one reason why many people, or some people live in the West Bank because housing is cheaper? Wasn't that?
It's not so much anymore. From what I hear, in Efrat, for example, it's $1 million for a house. That's not so cheap.
Oh, well, there goes that attraction. Well, look, thank you very much. I can see Liam hovering. Sorry, Liam, we haven't been more positive, but...
It's been excellent. Let's all give a hand, please, for Debbie, Noa, and Judy. I want to really thank, in addition to these three wonderful people, two of whom schlepped all the way out from Israel, I want to thank everyone in the room tonight who braved the weather for coming out here in Sydney, and everyone who is joining us at home as well. My name's Liam. I'm the Executive Director of NIF in Australia. And the thing that is, there are two things that are important about what NIF does. The first is that we're able to come together as a community to hear these issues and talk to people, especially who are affiliated with and work with such an important institution like Haaretz. I know, I'm sure many of you got push notifications from Haaretz, at least today and maybe even during this event. So it shows the importance of the connection that Haaretz is able to have with us from far away, and that NIF in Australia is able to bring even closer together. And the second thing is trying to respond to many of these trends and issues that Debbie, Noa and Judy have been able to bring up tonight, and that is to make real change on the ground, to have a real impact, to bring Jews and Arabs together, to counter the effects of the occupation, to work for the LGBT community, to work for social inclusion. These are the most important things that we can do today, especially because we don't know what's going to happen with the government. We don't know if it's going to collapse, and so we need to make sure that someone is there to make sure that people feel included, to make sure that people have the equality, justice and democracy that was promised to all inhabitants of Israel in the Declaration of Independence. So that's the way that we do it. That's NIF funds these projects, hundreds of projects and $500 million of funding from around the world over the last 45 years. So here in the room, it's all on your cards, and if you flip to the second side of it, you can see a QR code. You can take out your phones. Please consider giving and supporting these important projects before the end of June, before the end of the financial year. And at home, you're about to see the QR code on your screen in a minute. Or so. So thank you again, in particular as well to Max and Eve, our wonderful staff who have been here with us tonight, and Chris and Cliffy for helping on the AV and getting everything set up. Thank you everyone at home. Thank you everyone in the room. Thank you to everyone here. Have a wonderful night.